The sound of screeching tires echoed through the underground parking garage as three masked men cornered the woman in the expensive suit. Stella Romano, one of the city's most powerful CEOs, had nowhere to run. But she didn't know that her unlikely savior was mopping floors just 20 feet away, a single father named Dominic Bianchi, who had spent years hiding from his past. What happened next would change both their lives forever. Because when Dominic stepped out of the shadows using skills that had nothing to do with janitorial work, he had no idea he was saving the little sister he'd lost 23 years ago. And Stella had no clue that the man risking everything to protect her was the big brother she still dreamed about. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The parking garage beneath Pinnacle Tower had always been eerily quiet after business hours, but tonight the silence felt different. Dominic Bianchi pushed his cleaning cart between the rows of luxury vehicles, the wheels squeaking against the polished concrete floor. At 34, his broad shoulders and calloused hands spoke of years spent in more demanding work than his current custodial position. But he had made peace with this simpler life. The sound of car doors slamming echoed from the executive level, followed by the sharp click of heels against concrete. Dominic glanced up from the trash bin he was emptying, noting the late hour. Most executives had left by 7, but it wasn't unusual for the top floor to work later. He returned to his routine, methodically working his way through the designated cleaning schedule. That's when he heard the first scream. The sound cut through the underground space like a blade, immediately triggering instincts that Dominic had thought were buried forever. His head snapped toward the source, and what he saw made his blood run cold. 3 men in dark clothing had cornered a woman in an expensive navy suit against a black BMW. Even from a distance, he could see the terror in her posture as she clutched her briefcase like a shield. "Please, I don't know what you want," the woman's voice carried across the garage, professional composure cracking under fear. "If it's money, I can—" "Shut up and get in the van," one of the attackers growled, gesturing toward a white panel van idling near the exit ramp. "Make this easy on yourself." Dominic's mind automatically assessed the situation with the systematic precision that had once saved lives in emergency situations. 3 assailants, 1 victim, approximately 40 yards between him and the scene. The men were focused entirely on their target, unaware of his presence. The woman was backed against her vehicle with nowhere to run. Without conscious thought, Dominic's hands found the wheeled mop bucket beside his cart. In one fluid motion, he gripped the long aluminum handle and began moving toward the confrontation, his footsteps silent on the concrete floor. Years of crisis response training had taught him that hesitation killed people, and every second counted when someone's life hung in the balance. The first attacker reached for the woman's arm. Just as Dominic closed the distance, the aluminum mop handle connected with the man's wrist with surgical precision, the crack of bone audible even over the garage's ambient hum. Before the attacker could cry out, Dominic pivoted, using the handle like a staff to sweep the second man's legs, sending him crashing into the side of a nearby Mercedes. The third attacker spun toward this new threat, his hand moving toward something inside his jacket. But Dominic was already there, years of emergency medical training translating into an understanding of human anatomy that made him devastatingly effective. A precise strike to the man's shoulder caused his arm to go numb, while a follow-up blow to his solar plexus dropped him to his knees, gasping for breath. In less than 30 seconds, all 3 attackers were on the ground, groaning and disoriented. Dominic stood protectively between them and the woman, the mop handle still gripped in his hands, his breathing controlled despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. He turned toward the woman, noting her wide eyes and the way she pressed herself against her car as if trying to disappear into the metal. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice calm and professional, the same tone he had once used to reassure accident victims. The woman, who he now recognized as Stella Romano, the CEO whose face graced business magazines and news articles, shook her head slowly, unable to find words. She stared at him as if seeing a ghost, her dark eyes searching his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "We need to call security," Dominic continued, already reaching for the emergency phone. Mounted on a nearby concrete pillar, his movements were efficient and purposeful as he reported the incident, giving their exact location and requesting immediate police response. As sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second, Dominic found himself studying the woman he had just saved. There was something familiar about her features, the shape of her eyes, the set of her jaw that nagged at the edges of his memory. But before he could examine the feeling further, security personnel flooded the garage, followed quickly by police officers and paramedics. In the chaos that followed, Dominic gave his statement with minimal detail, describing what he had witnessed, and his response in the most ordinary terms possible. He mentioned his background in emergency medical services, explaining his ability to handle the situation, but volunteered nothing about the deeper training that had made his actions so precise and effective. As the police led away the handcuffed attackers and paramedics checked the woman for injuries, Dominic quietly returned to his cleaning cart. He finished his shift as if nothing extraordinary had happened, clocking out at the designated time and heading home to the small apartment where his 8-year-old daughter waited. But as he drove through the quiet streets of Millbrook Heights, Dominic couldn't shake the image of the woman's face, or the strange sense of recognition that had flickered through him during those brief moments of eye contact. Something about Stella Romano felt like an echo from a past he had spent years trying to forget. The alarm clock's shrill beeping pierced the pre-dawn darkness at 5:30 a.m., just as it had every weekday for the past 3 years. Dominic Bianchi rolled out of bed with the practiced efficiency of a man whose routine had become sacred, padding quietly across the worn hardwood floors of their modest 2-bedroom apartment in Millbrook Heights. The apartment was small but immaculately maintained, a reflection of the discipline that had carried him through his previous life as an EMT, and now served him well in his current role. The walls were painted in warm earth tones that Ivy had helped him choose, and every surface displayed evidence of his daughter's artistic talents. Crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator, clay sculptures crowding the windowsill, and watercolor paintings that transformed their simple home into a gallery of childhood wonder. By 6:15, Dominic had coffee brewing and was reviewing his cleaning schedule for Pinnacle Tower while preparing breakfast. The routine never varied: 2 pieces of whole grain toast, scrambled eggs, and fresh fruit arranged on plates that had once belonged to his grandmother. At exactly 6:30, he knocked gently on Ivy's bedroom door. "Good morning, sunshine," he called softly, hearing the rustle of bedsheets and a sleepy groan from within. "Breakfast in 10 minutes." Ivy Bell Bianchi emerged 15 minutes later, her dark hair a tangled mess and her school uniform slightly askew, but her eyes bright with the irrepressible energy that never failed to lift Dominic's spirits. At 8 years old, she possessed a curious mind and fearless spirit that reminded him daily of what truly mattered in life. "Did you remember to sign my field trip permission slip?" she asked, sliding into her chair at the small kitchen table. "Mrs. Patterson says we're going to the Natural History Museum, and they have real dinosaur bones, not just fake ones like at the mall." Dominic smiled, reaching for the signed form he had completed the night before. "Right here, kiddo. And I packed your lunch with extra snacks in case you get hungry looking at all those ancient creatures." As Ivy ate breakfast, she filled the space with animated chatter about her upcoming school day, her best friend Hazel's birthday party, and her latest artistic project, a family tree assignment that always made Dominic's chest tighten with emotions. He tried to keep buried. They had weathered that particular storm before, finding ways to celebrate the family they had built together, while acknowledging the complex history that had brought them to this point. "Dad," Ivy said suddenly, her fork halfway to her mouth, "Mrs. Patterson asked us to interview someone about their job for current events. Can I interview you about being a custodian?" The question was asked with the innocent directness that only young people possessed, but it carried weight that Ivy couldn't possibly understand. Dominic had been a paramedic for nearly a decade before. A combination of burnout, budget cuts, and personal circumstances had forced him to find more stable, predictable work. The transition from saving lives to cleaning buildings had been more challenging than he had ever admitted to anyone, including himself. "Of course," he replied, keeping his voice light. "Though I'm not sure mopping floors and emptying trash cans makes for the most exciting interview." Ivy rolled her eyes with the dramatic flair that seemed to be a requirement for 8-year-olds. "Dad, you make everything interesting. Remember when you explained how different cleaning chemicals work like medicines for buildings? That was way cooler than Tommy's dad talking about selling insurance." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The comparison made Dominic laugh, a genuine sound that seemed to brighten the entire apartment. Ivy had an extraordinary ability to find wonder in the mundane, a gift that had helped him appreciate the dignity in honest work and the value of providing stability for someone he loved more than his own life. After dropping Ivy at Oakwood Elementary School, where she bounded up the front steps with her backpack bouncing against her small frame, Dominic made the 20-minute drive to downtown Millbrook. Heights and Pinnacle Tower, the 40-story glass and steel structure, housed some of the city's most successful businesses, including Romano Enterprises, the technology conglomerate that occupied the top 5 floors. His shift began at 8 a.m. with a brief meeting in the maintenance office, located in the building's basement. The other custodial staff were a mix of ages and backgrounds, united by the shared understanding that their work, while often invisible to the building's white-collar occupants, was essential to maintaining the pristine environment that corporate success demanded. Morning Dom called Hugo Evans, a veteran custodian who had worked in the building for over 15 years. "You hear about the excitement in the parking garage last night? Police, ambulances, the whole 9 yards." Dominic kept his expression neutral as he collected his supplies and reviewed his assigned floors. "No, what happened?" "Someone tried to grab Ms. Romano from Romano Enterprises," Hugo continued, clearly relishing the opportunity to share information. "Word is one of the night cleaning crew fought them off. Can you imagine? Those corporate types probably never even noticed us before, but now one of us is a hero." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Dominic, but he simply nodded and began preparing his cart. His assigned areas included the executive floors, a responsibility that had been his for the past 6 months due to his reliability and attention to detail. The work was methodical and peaceful, allowing him time to think while his hands performed the familiar tasks of dusting, vacuuming, and maintaining the spotless environment that executives expected. As he worked his way through the 35th floor, Dominic found himself thinking about the previous night's events. The woman he had saved, Stella Romano, had looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. Recognition? Gratitude? Something deeper? The memory of her dark eyes and the familiar shape of her features continued to nag at him, like a word on the tip of his tongue that refused to surface. The feeling was complicated by memories he had spent years trying to bury. His early life had been marked by trauma and loss, experiences that had ultimately led him to emergency medical services as a way of making sense of suffering and finding purpose in helping others. But those same experiences had also left him with gaps in his memory, particularly from his youngest years, before the foster care system had given him stability, and eventually led him to the family who had adopted him and given him their name. Sometimes In quiet moments like these, fragments of older memories would surface, flashes of images, emotions, or sensations that seemed to belong to someone else's life. A little girl's laughter. The sound of his own voice, younger and more carefree, promising to always protect someone. The devastating grief of separation and loss that had shaped his understanding of how quickly everything could change. But those memories were like trying to hold water in cupped hands, slipping away whenever he tried to examine them too closely. The therapists he had worked with over the years had helped him understand that trauma could fragment memory, creating gaps and shadows that might never fully resolve. He had learned to live with the uncertainty, focusing instead on the life he was building with Ivy and the day-to-day responsibilities that anchored him in the present. The afternoon pickup at Oakwood Elementary was always the highlight of Dominic's day. Ivy would emerge from the school building with her arms full of artwork and her head full of stories, transforming the drive home into an adventure as she recounted every detail of her day. Today was no different, except for the unusual intensity of her excitement. "Dad, you're not going to believe what happened in art class," she said, practically vibrating in her seat as they drove through the tree-lined streets of their neighborhood. "Mrs. Chun had us draw pictures of people we admire, and I drew you in your work uniform because you help keep important buildings clean so people can do important work." The simple statement hit Dominic with unexpected force, reminding him once again of his daughter's remarkable ability to find meaning and value in things that others might overlook. In her eyes, his work wasn't just a job, it was a contribution to something larger, a way of caring for his community and providing for his family. "But that's not the really exciting part," Ivy continued, now pulling a folded piece of paper from her backpack. "Mrs. Chun said my drawing was so good that she wants to enter it in the district art contest. If I win, they'll display it at the public library for a whole month." That evening, as they sat at their small kitchen table working on homework together, Dominic found himself studying his daughter's face and marveling at the path that had led them to this moment. Ivy had come into his life when she was barely 2 years old, a frightened toddler whose own story of loss and displacement had intersected with his in ways that felt like destiny rather than coincidence. The adoption process had been lengthy and emotionally challenging, but it had also been the most important thing Dominic had ever done. In caring for Ivy, he had discovered reserves of patience, tenderness, and strength that he hadn't known he possessed. She had given him a reason to build a stable, predictable life, and in return, he had given her the security and unconditional love that every young person deserved. As he tucked Ivy into bed that night, reading from the chapter book they had been working through together, Dominic felt the familiar sense of contentment that these quiet moments always brought. This was his world, now small, perhaps, compared to the corporate powerhouses he cleaned for during the day, but rich with meaning and purpose. But as he turned off the light and closed Ivy's bedroom door, the image of Stella Romano's face returned unbidden to his mind. There had been something in her expression during those chaotic moments in the parking garage, something that had stirred memories and emotions he thought he had successfully buried. Whatever it was, he had the unsettling feeling that his carefully constructed quiet life was about to become much more complicated. The 63rd floor of Pinnacle Tower belonged entirely to Romano Enterprises, and every square inch of it reflected the exacting standards of its founder and CEO, Stella. Romano stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office, watching the morning sun cast geometric shadows across the cityscape of Millbrook Heights. At 31, she commanded a technology empire worth over $2 billion, but the view from the top often felt more isolating than triumphant. Her office was a study in controlled elegance, polished chrome and glass surfaces, carefully curated modern art, and furniture that prioritized clean lines over comfort. Everything had been chosen to project competence, success, and an almost intimidating level of sophistication. The only personal touch was a small silver frame on her desk containing a photo so old and faded that most visitors couldn't make out the details. Stella never explained the image to anyone, but several times each day, her eyes would drift to the two young faces smiling back at her from what felt like another lifetime. Romano Enterprises had started as a small software development company. 7 years earlier, built on Stella's revolutionary approach to data security and her almost supernatural ability to anticipate market trends. What had begun as a one-woman operation working from a rented office space had evolved into a major player in the technology sector, with contracts spanning government agencies, Fortune 500 companies, and international corporations. The success hadn't come easily. Stella's rise through the business world had required a level of focus and determination that left little room for personal relationships or emotional vulnerability. She had learned early that showing weakness in corporate environments was an invitation for exploitation. So she had perfected the art of professional armor, the impeccable suits, the measured responses, the strategic use of silence and intimidation. Ms. Romano, your 9 a.m. meeting with the Peterson Group has been moved to 9:30, announced Chloe Hall, her executive assistant, as she entered the office with a tablet full of scheduling updates. And the legal team needs your review on the Morrison contract before the board meeting this afternoon. Stella nodded without turning from the window. What about the security assessment I requested? Any updates from the building management? Chloe hesitated, a tell that Stella immediately recognized. After working together for 3 years, they had developed an efficient communication style that relied as much on unspoken cues as actual conversation. They've completed their initial review. The incident in the parking garage appears to have been a targeted attempt, not random crime. They're recommending enhanced personal security protocols. The memory of the previous night's attack sent an involuntary shiver down Stella's spine. She had built her career on maintaining control, on anticipating and managing risk, but the moment those 3 men had cornered her in the parking garage, all of her carefully constructed defenses had crumbled. The terror she had felt in those few minutes had been more intense than anything she had experienced since childhood, when control hadn't been an option and safety had been a luxury she couldn't afford. But it wasn't just the attack itself that had left her unsettled. It was the man who had saved her, the custodian whose quick thinking and surprising skill had turned a nightmare into a rescue. There had been something about his face, his voice, his movements that had triggered memories she thought she had successfully buried. The way he had positioned himself protectively between her and danger. The calm authority in his voice when he had asked if she was hurt. The strange sense of familiarity that had made her want to stare at him, even in the midst of chaos. Schedule a meeting with building security for this afternoon, Stella said, finally turning away from the window. I want a complete review of all access protocols and surveillance systems. And see if you can find personnel files for the custodial staff member who assisted me last night. If Chloe found the request unusual, she gave no indication. I'll have the information ready within the hour. Is there anything specific you're looking for? Stella hesitated, unsure how to articulate the strange pull she felt toward learning more about the man who had risked his safety for a stranger. Just standard background information. I want to properly thank him for his intervention. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of meetings, conference calls, and strategic decisions that would affect thousands of employees and millions of dollars in revenue. Stella moved through her responsibilities with the mechanical precision that had become second nature, but part of her attention remained focused on the growing pile of information that Chloe was compiling about Dominic Bianchi, the personnel file made for interesting reading. 34 years old, employed with the building's custodial service for 3 years, perfect attendance record, and commendations for reliability and attention to detail. Previous employment as an M2 with the County Emergency Services, which explained his ability to handle crisis situations. Personal information was minimal, single father to an 8-year-old adopted daughter, Address in Millbrook Heights. No. Criminal record. Excellent references from previous employers. But it was the photograph attached to his employment application that stopped Stella cold. The professional headshot showed a man with dark hair and serious eyes, but there was something in his expression, a combination of strength and gentleness, that made her chest tighten with emotions she couldn't name. She found herself studying every detail of his face, searching for something she couldn't quite identify. The lunch meeting with potential investors required Stella's full attention, but she found her mind wandering back to the parking garage incident and the growing puzzle of Dominic Bianchi. Romano Enterprises was built on her ability to analyze data, identify patterns, and draw logical conclusions. But this situation defied her usual systematic approach. Her reaction to this man wasn't based on rational assessment. It was visceral, emotional, and completely outside her normal range of responses. "Stella, are you with us?" The voice of James Peterson, lead investor for the Peterson Group, cut through her distraction. She realized that the entire table was looking at her expectantly, waiting for her response to a question she hadn't heard. "I'm sorry," she said, immediately shifting back into professional mode. "Could you repeat the question?" "I was reviewing the financial projections in my head." The meeting continued without further incident, but Stella was troubled by her lapse in focus. She had built her reputation on being fully present and engaged in every business interaction, and allowing personal matters to interfere with professional responsibilities was a luxury she couldn't afford. By late afternoon, the weight of the previous night's events and the strange emotional turbulence of the day had begun to take its toll. Stella found herself standing once again at the windows of her office, watching the busy street life far below and feeling more disconnected from the world than ever. The Romano Enterprises empire had been built on her vision of technology as a tool for connection and communication, but her personal life remained starkly isolated. She lived alone in a luxury penthouse apartment across town, filled with beautiful objects and stunning views, but lacking the warmth and chaos that made a house feel like a home. Her romantic relationships had been few and generally unsuccessful, victims of her demanding schedule and emotional unavailability. Her friendships were mostly professional connections, built around shared business interests rather than genuine personal affinity. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had created systems that helped millions of people connect with each other, while remaining fundamentally alone herself. The thought was particularly sharp today, in the aftermath of an experience that had stripped away her usual defenses and left her feeling vulnerable in ways she had forgotten were possible. "Ms. Romano?" Chloe's voice interrupted her brooding. "Building security is here for your 4 p.m. meeting." The security briefing was thorough and professionally delivered, but it only reinforced what Stella already knew. Someone had specifically targeted her, and the attack would likely not be the last attempt. The building's security director recommended a comprehensive review of her personal safety protocols, including the possibility of hiring private protection services. "What about the custodial staff member who intervened?" Stella asked. "Has he been interviewed about what he observed?" "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Bianchi provided a statement to police, but he's not part of our security team. His employment is with the cleaning service contractor, not directly with building management." Stella nodded, but her mind was already working on a different angle. If the conventional security services couldn't provide the protection she needed, perhaps she could find a more unconventional solution. Dominic Bianchi had already proven his ability to handle dangerous situations, and his connection to the building meant he would be familiar with the environment and potential vulnerabilities. More importantly, there was something about him that made her feel safer than any professional bodyguard could. It wasn't just his physical capabilities, it was the immediate, instinctive way he had positioned himself between her and danger, as if protecting her had been his natural response rather than a conscious decision. As evening approached and the Building began to empty of its daytime occupants. Stella found herself making an unusual decision. Instead of leaving through the executive elevator directly to the parking garage, she took the service elevator down to the custodial areas in the building's basement. She had never ventured into this part of Pinnacle Tower before, and the utilitarian corridors felt like a different world from the polished corporate spaces above. She found Dominic Bianchi exactly where she had expected, methodically organizing cleaning supplies and preparing for the evening shift. He looked up as she approached, surprise flickering across his features before settling into the same calm professionalism he had displayed during the attack. "Ms. Romano," he said, straightening from the supply cart he had been organizing. "Is everything all right?" Standing there in the fluorescent-lit basement corridor, still wearing her immaculate business suit while he wore the simple uniform of the custodial staff, Stella was struck again by the strange sense of recognition that had haunted her since the previous night. There was something about his presence that felt simultaneously foreign and familiar, like a half-remembered song or a face from a dream. "I wanted to thank you properly for what you did last night," she said, her voice sounding oddly formal to her own ears. "And I have a proposition that might interest you." The collision happened exactly the way these things usually do, unexpectedly, innocently, and with the kind of perfect timing that makes you wonder if the universe has a sense of humor. Ivy Bell Bianchi was supposed to be with her third-grade class on their educational tour of Pinnacle Tower's corporate facilities, but 8-year-olds have their own relationship with supposed to, and Ivy had always been particularly creative in her interpretations of rules. The tour group had been exploring the public areas of the 35th floor, learning about how modern office buildings operate and the various careers that keep them functioning. Mrs. Patterson, Ivy's teacher, had been discussing the importance of teamwork and how everyone's job contributes to the larger success of the organization. But Ivy's attention had been captured by something far more interesting than corporate philosophy. She had spotted her father's cleaning cart through a doorway at the end of the hall. While Mrs. Patterson was explaining fire safety protocols to the rest of the class, Ivy had quietly slipped away from the group, drawn by the irresistible opportunity to surprise her dad at work. She had been planning this moment since learning about the field trip, imagining the look on his face when she appeared unexpectedly in his workplace. What she hadn't counted on was taking a wrong turn in the maze of corridors that connected the executive floors. Instead of finding her father, she found herself in an elegant reception area with marble floors and dramatic artwork. Completely lost and beginning to feel the first stirrings of panic, that's when Stella Romano emerged from the executive elevator. Ivy was studying a large abstract painting, trying to figure out if it was supposed to look like something she could recognize, when she heard the soft chime of the elevator doors opening. She turned to see a woman in a beautiful dark blue suit stepping into the reception area, moving with the kind of confident grace that Ivy associated with princesses in fairy tales. The woman stopped when she saw Ivy, surprise flickering across her features. "Hello," she said, her voice carrying the slight edge of someone who wasn't accustomed to finding unattended individuals in her private space. "Are you lost?" Ivy nodded, suddenly feeling very small in the vast reception area. "I was looking for my dad, but I think I took a wrong turn. My class is visiting the building for school, and I wanted to surprise him, but now I don't know where I am." Something in Stella's expression softened. She moved closer, crouching down to bring herself to Ivy's eye level, a gesture that immediately put the young girl at ease. "What's your father's name? Maybe I can help you find him." "Dominic Bianchi," Ivy said, brightening at the prospect of adult assistance. "He works here cleaning the offices. He says it's important work because he helps keep the building beautiful for all the people who work here." The name hit Stella like a physical impact. This was the daughter of the man who had saved her life, standing here in her executive offices with the same dark eyes and thoughtful expression that had been haunting her thoughts for the past week. The resemblance was unmistakable now that she was looking for it, the shape of the jaw, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the quiet intelligence that seemed to radiate from her small frame. Bianchi, Stella repeated, testing the name on her tongue. That's an unusual coincidence. Your father ... helped me recently with a difficult situation. Ivy's eyes widened with interest. You know my dad? That's so cool. He's really good at helping people. He used to be a paramedic, which means he saved people who were hurt or scared. Now he has a different job, but he still likes to help when people need it. The simple pride in Ivy's voice when she talked about her father touched something deep inside Stella's chest. She had spent so many years in corporate environments where relationships were strategic and conversations were calculated, that she had almost forgotten what uncomplicated affection sounded like. He sounds like a very special person, Stella said, and meant it more than she had expected to. Would you like me to help you find him? As they walked through the building's corridors together, Ivy kept up a steady stream of chatter that revealed far more about Dominic Bianchi than any personnel file could have captured. She talked about their evening routine of homework and reading together, about the art projects that covered every surface of their apartment, about the way he always made sure she felt safe and loved even when money was tight. My dad says that the most important thing about a job isn't how much money you make, but whether you're doing something that helps other people, Ivy explained as they took the service elevator down to the custodial areas. He says that taking care of buildings is like taking care of people, because everyone deserves to work in a place that's clean and beautiful. Stella found herself genuinely moved by this 8-year-old's perspective on work and purpose. In her world of corporate strategy and profit margins, she rarely encountered such straightforward appreciation for the dignity of honest labor. Ivy's obvious admiration for her father was refreshing and slightly humbling. They found Dominic exactly where the building directory indicated he would be, in the break room adjacent to the custodial supply areas, eating a simple lunch while reviewing his afternoon schedule. When he looked up and saw his daughter walking beside Stella Romano, his expression went through a rapid series of changes: surprise, concern, confusion, and something else that Stella couldn't quite identify. Ivy, he said, rising quickly from his chair. What are you doing here? Where's your class? I wanted to surprise you, but I got lost, Ivy explained, rushing to her father and hugging him around the waist. But it's okay because Ms. Romano helped me find you. She says she knows you. Dominic's eyes met Stella's over his daughter's head, and for a moment, the small break room felt charged with unspoken recognition. There was something in his gaze, a searching quality, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle that had been troubling him. Ms. Romano was very kind to help you, Dominic said, his voice carefully neutral. But you need to get back to your class before Mrs. Patterson realizes you're missing. Stella watched the interaction between father and daughter with growing fascination. There was an easy intimacy between them that spoke of years of shared routines and unconditional love. Dominic's entire demeanor had shifted when Ivy appeared, his professional reserve melting into something warm and protective that made him seem like a completely different person. Actually, Stella said, surprising herself with the words, I was hoping to speak with your father about a work matter. Perhaps you could show me some of your artwork while we talk. Ivy's face lit up with delight. She immediately began pulling folded papers from her backpack, eager to share her latest creations with this unexpected audience. As she spread her drawings across the break room table, explaining each one with the detailed enthusiasm that only young artists possess, Stella found herself genuinely charmed by the girl's creativity and confidence. This one is a picture of our apartment, Ivy said, pointing to a crayon drawing that showed a modest living space filled with colorful decorations. And this is my dad at work, keeping the building clean so everyone can do their important jobs. The drawing showed a stick figure in a uniform pushing what was clearly meant to be a cleaning cart. But there was something heroic in the way Ivy had rendered her father, cape-like lines flowing from his shoulders, a broad smile on his circular face, and what appeared to be sparkles radiating from the clean surfaces around him. "He looks very heroic," Stella observed, and she wasn't just being polite. There was something about the way Ivy saw her father that resonated with Stella's own experience of being rescued by him. "He is heroic," Ivy said matter-of-factly. "Mrs. Patterson says, heroes are people who help others, even when it's hard or scary. My dad does that every day." As Stella watched Dominic gently guide his daughter back toward the main building to rejoin her class, she was struck by how naturally he moved through the role of protector and caregiver. There was no hesitation in his responses, no calculation of cost or benefit, just immediate, instinctive care for the person who mattered most to him. When he returned to the break room after ensuring Ivy was safely back with her group, the atmosphere between them had shifted. The presence of his daughter had somehow made their interaction more personal, breaking down some of the professional barriers that had characterized their previous encounters. "She's remarkable," Stella said, and the sincerity in her voice seemed to surprise them both. "She's everything good in my life," Dominic replied simply. "I'm sorry she interrupted your day. She's usually better about following rules, but she gets excited about unexpected opportunities." Stella shook her head. "Don't apologize. Meeting her was illuminating. She clearly adores you." Something in Dominic's expression became guarded, as if he was trying to determine whether Stella's interest in his family was purely professional or something more complex. "Ms. Romano, you mentioned wanting to discuss a work matter?" The question brought them back to the purpose of Stella's visit, but the conversation with Ivy had changed the context entirely. What had started as a business proposition now felt more personal, more complicated. Stella found herself studying Dominic's face again, searching for the source of the strange recognition that seemed to grow stronger every time they interacted. "I need someone I can trust," she said finally, choosing her words carefully. "The incident in the parking garage wasn't random, and there's reason to believe it won't be the last attempt. I want to hire you as a personal security consultant." Dominic's expression remained neutral, but she could see him processing the offer, weighing it against considerations she could only guess at. "Ms. Romano, I appreciate the confidence, but I'm not qualified for that kind of work. I clean offices and empty trash cans. That's very different from providing professional security services." "You stopped 3 armed men with a mop handle," Stella pointed out. "That suggests qualifications that go beyond custodial work." "That was emergency medical training and pure luck," Dominic insisted. "I'm not a security professional, and I have responsibilities that prevent me from taking risks with my personal safety." Stella understood that he was talking about Ivy, and she respected his priorities even as she felt disappointed by his refusal. But there was something else in his expression, a flicker of curiosity or recognition, that made her think his decision wasn't entirely based on practical considerations. "What if I told you that working for me might help you understand something about yourself that you've been trying to remember?" she said, the words emerging before she had fully thought them through. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither of them was prepared to address directly. But in Dominic's eyes, Stella saw the same searching expression that had been haunting her own thoughts, the sense that they were circling around a truth that was both important and potentially devastating. The second attempt came exactly 1 week after the first, as if the attackers had been studying Stella's routines and waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike again. This time, they had chosen the executive parking level during the busy transition period between day and evening shifts, when the garage was crowded enough to provide cover, but distracted enough to delay response. Stella had stayed late to finish quarterly projections, a task that required the kind of focused concentration that was impossible during regular business hours. By the time she gathered her materials and headed toward the elevator, most of the executive floor was empty, and the building had settled into its after-hours quiet. She was thinking about the meeting scheduled for the following morning when the elevator doors opened on the parking level and she stepped into what felt like a perfectly normal evening routine. The first sign that something was wrong came from her peripheral vision, a white van parked in a spot that had been empty that morning, positioned in a way that blocked the security camera's view of her reserved parking space. The second sign was the absence of the usual ambient sounds. No footsteps echoing from the stairwells, no car engine starting up, no conversation from other late-working executives heading home. By the time Stella recognized the silence as a warning, it was too late to retreat back into the elevator. 3 men emerged from behind parked cars with the coordinated precision of a military operation, cutting off her escape routes and herding her toward the waiting van. "Ms. Romano," the leader said, his voice calm and professional in a way that was somehow more terrifying than shouting would have been. "We're going to keep this simple. You're coming with us, and if you cooperate, nobody gets hurt." Stella's mind raced through her options, all of which seemed to lead to the same inevitable conclusion. The parking garage that had seemed familiar and safe suddenly felt like a trap, with concrete pillars creating blind spots and the ceiling too low for her voice to carry to the upper levels, where help might be available. "What do you want?" she asked, trying to buy time while scanning for any possibility of escape or assistance. "We want you to disappear for a while," the man replied, gesturing toward the van. "Some people think you've become too influential, too successful. They'd prefer a business environment where Romano Enterprises wasn't quite so dominant." The explanation confirmed what Stella had suspected since the first attack. This wasn't about money or personal revenge. This was corporate warfare carried out through criminal means, an attempt to destabilize her company by removing her from the equation. The realization was both terrifying and infuriating, representing everything she had fought against during her rise through the business world. "You can't seriously think that kidnapping me will solve anything," Stella said, backing slowly toward her car while trying to keep all 3 men in sight. "Romano Enterprises has succession plans, security, protocols, legal protections, all of which become irrelevant if you simply vanish," the leader interrupted. "No body, no crime, no investigation. Just a successful businesswoman who decided to take an extended vacation and never came back." That's when Stella heard the soft squeak of wheels on concrete, a sound so familiar that she had stopped noticing it during her months of working late in the building. But tonight, that everyday sound felt like salvation. Dominic Bianchi appeared from behind a concrete pillar pushing his cleaning cart, moving with the same methodical pace that characterized all of his work routines. To the attackers, he was simply part of the building's invisible infrastructure, no more threatening than the security cameras or the fluorescent lights overhead. But Stella saw the moment when his gaze took in the scene. The way his body language shifted almost imperceptibly as he assessed the situation and began moving with purpose rather than routine. She saw him process the positions of the 3 men, the blocking tactics they were using, the escape routes they had eliminated. "Evening, Ms. Romano," Dominic said in the same professional tone he always used, as if discovering her cornered by 3 threatening strangers was perfectly normal. "Working late again?" The casualness of his greeting seemed to confuse the attackers, who had clearly not planned for any interruption to their carefully orchestrated operation. The leader gestured impatiently at Dominic, obviously expecting him to be frightened away by the implicit threat. "Keep moving, maintenance man," he said. "This doesn't concern you." Dominic paused, appearing to consider the situation with the kind of deliberate thoughtfulness that Stella had noticed in their previous interactions. When he spoke, his voice carried a new quality, something harder and more authoritative than his usual custodial politeness. Actually, building security is part of my job description, he said, moving his cleaning cart into a position that blocked the attacker's most direct path to the van. And right now, I'm seeing some people who don't belong in this parking area. What happened next unfolded with the kind of choreographed violence that looked almost like a dance, if dance could be both beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Dominic moved with fluid precision, using every element of his environment, the cleaning cart, the concrete pillars, even the low-hanging pipes of the garage ceiling, as weapons or defensive tools. The first attacker lunged forward, clearly expecting to overwhelm what appeared to be an untrained civilian. Instead, he found himself on the receiving end of a calculated strike that used his own momentum against him, sending him sprawling across the hood of a nearby BMW. With a sound that echoed through the garage like a gunshot, the second attacker tried to flank Dominic from the left, but encountered the business end of a mop handle that moved like a staff in the hands of someone who understood leverage, timing, and anatomy. The precise application of force to pressure points left the man conscious but completely incapacitated, curled on the concrete floor and struggling to breathe. The third attacker, the leader, was smart enough to recognize that this was no ordinary custodian. He reached inside his jacket for what was presumably a weapon, but Dominic was already moving, closing the distance, with a burst of speed that left no time for the man to complete his draw. The final confrontation lasted less than 10 seconds and ended with the leader unconscious beside his colleagues. All three men neutralized with an efficiency that spoke of training far beyond what any civilian job would require. In the sudden silence that followed, Stella found herself staring at Dominic with a mixture of gratitude, amazement, and growing recognition. There was something about the way he moved, the instinctive protective positioning, the calm competence in the face of danger, that triggered memories she had thought were lost forever. "Are you hurt?" Dominic asked, the question delivered in the same professional tone he had used during their first encounter. But now Stella could hear something else beneath the surface: genuine concern, personal investment, an emotional connection that went beyond the ordinary interaction between building employee and executive. "I'm fine," she replied, though her voice was shakier than she would have liked. Where did you learn to do that?" Dominic was already moving toward the emergency phone mounted on a nearby wall, his actions efficient and purposeful. ENT training includes crisis response and basic self-defense. "I'll call building security and the police." But Stella barely heard his explanation. She was too focused on studying his face, searching for the source of the recognition that was growing stronger with each passing moment. There was something about his profile, the set of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders when he was being protective, that felt achingly familiar. As police sirens wailed in the distance and building security personnel began flooding the garage, Stella found herself remembering fragments of dreams she had been having for years, dreams of a boy with dark hair and serious eyes who had promised to always keep her safe. Dreams of a voice whispering that everything would be okay, that he would never let anything bad happen to her. Dreams of a brother she had lost so long ago that she had almost convinced herself he had never existed at all. When Dominic returned from making his report, Stella was still standing beside her car, her mind reeling with the implications of what she was beginning to suspect. She looked at him with new eyes, searching for traces of the young boy she had been separated from more than 20 years earlier. "Dominic," she said, testing his name on her tongue. "That's not the name you were born with, is it?" The question hit him like a physical blow. She saw recognition flicker across his features, followed immediately by confusion and something that looked like hope. For a long moment, they stood facing each other in the fluorescent-lit garage, both afraid to voice the possibility that was growing between them. "How could you possibly know that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Stella's hand went instinctively to the small silver frame she always carried in her briefcase. The faded photograph that was the only tangible proof of a life that had been shattered by tragedy and bureaucratic indifference. With trembling fingers, she pulled out the picture and held it toward him. The photograph showed two young faces smiling at the camera. A boy who looked to be about 9 years old with his arm protectively around a girl who couldn't have been more than 6. Both had dark hair and serious eyes, and both wore expressions of absolute trust in each other and in the world around them. Dominic stared at the photograph as if he was seeing a ghost. His hand reached out automatically, stopping just short of touching the image, as if contact might make it disappear. "Stella?" he whispered, the name carrying more than 20 years of loss, searching, and impossible hope. "Little Stella Romano?" The sound of her childhood name in his voice broke something loose inside her chest. All the professional composure, all the emotional armor she had built up over the years of fighting her way through the corporate world, crumbled in the face of this impossible reunion. "Dom?" she replied, using the nickname that had belonged to the brother who had been her whole world before everything fell apart. "Is it really you?" The embrace that followed felt like coming home after decades of being lost. For the first time in more than 20 years, Stella Romano was no longer alone in the world, and Dominic Bianchi had found the piece of his past that had been haunting his dreams and shaping his protective instincts without his conscious understanding. In the middle of a parking garage, surrounded by police officers and security personnel investigating an attempted kidnapping, two siblings who had been torn apart by tragedy had finally found their way back to each other. The revelation that changed everything happened in the sterile fluorescent lighting of a parking garage, but the real conversation took place 3 hours later in Stella's executive office, high above the city lights of Millbrook Heights. The police had finished their reports, the security team had completed their initial assessment, and the building had returned to its normal evening quiet. But nothing would ever be normal again for either Dominic or Stella. Stella sat behind her imposing glass desk, still wearing the same navy suit she had worn during the attack, though it was now slightly wrinkled from the embrace they had shared in the garage. The small silver picture frame sat between them on the polished surface, the faded photograph serving as irrefutable proof of a connection that defied all logic and probability. Dominic occupied one of the leather chairs across from her desk, looking oddly formal in his custodial uniform in the elegant corporate environment. But the contrast in their clothing couldn't diminish the intensity of the recognition that had been building between them since their first encounter. Every gesture, every inflection, every unconscious mannerism was triggering memories that had been buried for more than 2 decades. "I remember the day they separated us," Stella said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of years of unanswered questions. "You kept telling me that you would find me, that you would never stop looking. I held on to that promise for years before I finally gave up hope." Dominic's hands were clasped tightly in his lap, his knuckles white with tension. "I tried everything I could think of. Foster care records, adoption agencies, social services. But the system was designed to protect privacy, not reunite families. Every door I tried led to another dead end." The memories were returning in fragments now, triggered by the familiar cadence of each other's voices and the shared recognition of expressions and gestures that had remained unchanged despite the passage of time. Stella remembered a 9-year-old boy who had read her bedtime stories and braided her hair with careful concentration. Dominic remembered a 6-year-old girl who had followed him everywhere and believed he could fix anything that was broken. "The Romano family adopted me 6 months after we were separated," Stella continued, her fingers tracing the edge of the photograph. "They were kind people, successful people, but they already had older children and busy careers. I was more of a project than a daughter, a chance for them to do something meaningful while maintaining their social status." Dominic nodded, understanding the complex emotions that came with being raised by well-meaning people who couldn't provide the emotional connection that trauma required. The Bianchi family fostered me for 2 years before the adoption went through. They were good to me, gave me stability and education, but I never stopped feeling like a guest in their house. Like I was always waiting for permission to belong somewhere. The conversation was punctuated by long silences as they both processed the magnitude of what had happened. 23 years of separation, of building separate lives and identities, of carrying the unconscious ache of incomplete family. The successful CEO and the humble custodian were really a sister and brother who had been searching for each other without knowing it. How did we not recognize each other immediately? Stella asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. I mean, looking at you now, I can see him. I can see the boy who used to protect me from nightmares and make sure I always had the larger half of whatever we were sharing. Trauma changes how memory works, Dominic replied, drawing on knowledge he had gained both through personal experience and professional training. When you're that young and the separation is that traumatic, the mind protects itself by burying details that are too painful to process. We remembered the feelings, the love, the protection, the loss, but not necessarily the specifics. Stella stood and moved to the window, looking down at the city where they had both been living and working for years, completely unaware of each other's proximity. All this time, you were right here. Ivy talked about her father constantly during our conversation, describing someone who sounded too good to be true. I should have realized. How could you have realized? Dominic interrupted gently. I changed my first name when I turned 18. Too many bad associations with the foster care system, and Romano was your adopted name. We were looking for people who no longer existed. The practical realities of their situation began to assert themselves as the initial shock of recognition wore off. Stella turned back to face her brother, and Dominic could see her shifting into the analytical mode that had built her business empire. Someone is trying to destroy Romano Enterprises by eliminating me, she said, her voice taking on the crisp efficiency that characterized her corporate persona. 2 coordinated attacks in 1 week, both specifically targeting me, both with inside knowledge of my schedule and security protocols. This isn't random crime, it's strategic warfare. Dominic nodded, his own protective instincts sharpening as he considered the implications. Do you have any idea who might want to remove you from the equation? Business competitors, former employees, investment partners who might benefit from your absence? Stella returned to her desk and pulled up several files on her computer, turning the screen so Dominic could see the information. Romano Enterprises has been acquiring smaller companies at an aggressive pace over the past 2 years. We've disrupted several established markets and made some powerful enemies in the process. The list of people who would benefit from my disappearance is longer than I'd like to admit. As they reviewed the potential suspects, Dominic found himself slipping naturally into the role he had been trying to avoid: protector, problem solver, the person who stood between danger and the people he cared about. The transition felt inevitable, as if 23 years of separation had been erased by the simple act of recognition. I can't let you face this alone, he said, though the words carried implications that neither of them was fully prepared to address. Not now that I've found you again. Stella looked up from the computer screen, her expression a mixture of relief and concern. Dominic, you have Ivy to think about. You can't risk your safety for my business problems. I have resources, professional security services, CORPORAT, protection protocols, all of which failed to prevent 2 attempts on your life, Dominic pointed out. And those resources don't have 23 years of motivation to keep you safe. The argument that followed was both professional and deeply personal, touching on questions of family obligation, parental responsibility, and the complex dynamics of siblings who were essentially strangers despite their shared history. Stella wanted protection for her brother more than protection for herself. Dominic couldn't bear the thought of losing his sister again after spending most of his adult life unconsciously searching for her. "What about Ivy?" Stella asked, voicing the concern that was central to both of their considerations. "She needs stability, routine, a father who comes home safely every night. You can't risk making her an orphan for my sake." Dominic was quiet for a long moment, considering not just the practical implications, but the emotional complexity of their situation. "Ivy already knows something important is happening. She's asked me 3 times this week why I seem thinking so loud, which is her way of saying I'm distracted by something significant." "She's remarkably perceptive for an 8-year-old, Stella observed, remembering her brief but meaningful interaction with her niece during the building tour. "She gets that from her mother," Dominic said, his voice softening in the way it always did when he talked about Carmen. "Carmen always said that Ivy had an old soul, that she understood things on a level that most adults never reached." The mention of Ivy's mother created another layer of complexity to their reunion. Stella realized that she had a sister-in-law she would never meet and a niece who had experienced her own profound loss. The family she was discovering was already marked by the same kind of trauma that had shaped her own life. "Tell me about Carmen," Stella said, recognizing that understanding Dominic's life meant understanding the woman who had been his partner in creating it. Dominic's expression became both tender and sad as he spoke about the wife he had lost. "She was a teacher at Ivy's elementary school. That's how I met her. She was helping to coordinate a safety presentation for the kids, and I was there as part of the EMT demonstration. She asked more questions than anyone else, not because she didn't understand, but because she wanted to make sure she could teach the children properly." As he talked about Carmen's compassion, her dedication to her students, and her natural gift for making everyone around her feel valued and understood, Stella began to see how her brother had built a life centered around service and protection. The woman he had chosen to love had shared his instinct for caring for others, and together they had created a family based on the same values that had defined their childhood relationship. "She would have loved meeting you," Dominic said, and Stella could hear both truth and sadness in his voice. "She always said that family wasn't just about blood. It was about the people who showed up when you needed them most." The conversation gradually shifted from personal reminiscences to practical planning. If Dominic was going to help protect Stella while she dealt with the threats against her company, they needed to establish protocols that would keep Ivy safe and maintain the routines that anchored her sense of security. "I could arrange for private security for Ivy," Stella offered. "Discreet protection that wouldn't interfere with her school schedule or daily activities." Dominic shook his head. "That would only frighten her and signal to anyone watching that we're aware of a larger threat. Better to keep her routine normal, while making sure she's never truly alone." They spent the next hour developing a plan that would allow Dominic to provide security for Stella, while maintaining his role as a devoted father. It would require carefully coordinated schedules, backup childcare arrangements, and a level of trust that felt both natural and terrifying, given how recently they had discovered each other. As the evening wore on, and the building around them settled into its nighttime quiet, both siblings found themselves grappling with the surreal reality of their situation. Less than 12 hours earlier, they had been strangers connected only by a vague sense of mutual recognition. Now they were planning to work together to identify and neutralize threats against Stella's life and business empire. "There's something else we need to discuss," Stella said as they prepared to leave the office. "When this is over, when we've identified who's behind the attacks and eliminated the threat, what happens to us? How do we rebuild a relationship that was interrupted 23 years ago?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with hopes and fears that neither was fully prepared to articulate. They were siblings, but they were also strangers. They shared blood and childhood memories, but they had become completely different people during their years apart. "We figure it out as we go," Dominic said finally. "Just like we did when we were kids." One day at a time, one problem at a time, always watching out for each other. Stella smiled, the expression transforming her face in a way that reminded Dominic powerfully of the little girl who had trusted him completely to keep her safe from everything that scared her. "Some things never change," she said, and for the first time since their reunion, both siblings felt the solid ground of certainty beneath their feet. The routine they established over the following weeks was an intricate dance of professional necessity and personal rediscovery. Dominic continued his custodial duties during regular business hours, maintaining the cover that allowed him to move freely throughout Pinnacle Tower while observing potential threats and security vulnerabilities. But his real work began after the building emptied of its normal occupants, when he would transition from maintenance worker to personal protector. Stella's office became their informal headquarters, a space where CEO and former MTIG review intelligence, plan responses, and gradually reconstruct the relationship that had been severed by forces beyond their control. The contrast between her corporate authority and his practical expertise created a dynamic that was both professionally effective and personally healing. "The Peterson Group meeting has been moved to Thursday afternoon," Stella said one evening as they reviewed her schedule for the following week. "And I've received 3 more acquisition proposals that require on-site evaluations. Any of those locations could provide opportunities for another attempt." Dominic studied the documents spread across her desk, applying the risk assessment skills he had developed as an emergency responder to the complex world of corporate security. "The Peterson Group meeting worries me most. Too many attendees, too many variables we can't control. If someone wanted to create a distraction or confusion that would mask an attack, a large business meeting would provide perfect cover." Their evening sessions had become a blend of strategic planning and tentative personal sharing, as they slowly revealed the details of their separate lives and began to understand who they had become during their years apart. Stella spoke about the loneliness of corporate success, the way that professional achievement had isolated her from meaningful personal connections. Dominic shared his experiences as a single father, the constant balancing act between providing for Ivy and being present for her emotional needs. "I've been thinking about our childhood," Stella said during one of these conversations, her voice carrying the careful tone she used when approaching emotionally complex topics. "Do you remember the games we used to play when things got bad? At home, you would create these elaborate scenarios where we were explorers or detectives or secret agents, and somehow the real world would disappear for a while." Dominic nodded, the memories surfacing with surprising clarity now that they had been given permission to exist. "You were always the brave one in those games. I would set up the adventure, but you were the one who would charge ahead without worrying about the consequences. You trusted me to keep you safe, and that trust made me feel like I really could protect you from anything. Maybe that's why I became so driven in business," Stella mused. "When you weren't there anymore to create those safe spaces, I had to learn to build them myself. Corporate success became a way of proving that I could control my environment, that I could make myself invulnerable to the kind of loss we experienced." The psychological insights that emerged from their conversations were illuminating for both siblings. They began to understand how their childhood trauma had shaped their adult choices. Stella's drive for control and independence, Dominic's focus on service and protection. The successful CEO and the humble custodian were both trying to solve the same fundamental problem: how to create safety and stability in a world that had taught them how quickly everything could be taken away. Their investigation into the threats against Romano Enterprises was yielding disturbing patterns. The attacks were being coordinated by someone with intimate knowledge of Stella's business operations, personal habits, and security protocols. More troubling, the financial analysis suggested that the attempts were being funded by substantial resources. This wasn't opportunistic crime, but strategic warfare with significant backing. "Look at this pattern," Dominic said one evening. pointing to a timeline he had constructed showing the correlation between Romano Enterprises' major business moves and the escalation of security threats. Every significant acquisition, every market disruption, every competitive advantage your company has gained has been followed by increased attempts at corporate espionage or direct intimidation. Stella studied the timeline with the analytical intensity that had built her business empire. Someone isn't just trying to eliminate me. They're trying to systematically dismantle everything I've built. This is personal in a way that goes beyond normal business competition. The revelation deepened their sense of urgency while also strengthening their partnership. They were no longer just siblings protecting each other. They were collaborators, working to preserve something larger than themselves. Romano Enterprises represented not just corporate success, but proof that someone who had started with nothing could build something significant through intelligence, determination, and ethical business practices. Their investigation was complicated by the growing complexity of their personal relationship. Ivy had accepted Stella's increased presence in their lives with the adaptability that made her such a remarkable young person. But she was also asking increasingly sophisticated questions about the nature of their connection. "Dad, why does Ms. Romano visit our apartment for dinner every Sunday?" Ivy asked one evening as they were cleaning up after one of these family meals. "She's really important, and probably has fancier places to eat." Dominic and Stella exchanged glances across the small kitchen, still navigating the challenge of explaining their relationship without revealing the full complexity of their situation. They had agreed to be honest with Ivy about their family connection, but the details of childhood trauma and forced separation seemed too heavy for an 8-year-old to process. "Ms. Romano and I knew each other when we were very young," Dominic said carefully. "We lost touch for many years, and now we're getting to know each other again as adults." Ivy considered this explanation with the serious expression she wore when processing new information. "So she's like family, but not exactly family?" "She's exactly family," Stella said, her voice carrying a warmth that had become more natural over the weeks of shared dinners and gradually deepening trust. "Sometimes people find their family in unexpected places." The Sunday dinners had become sacred time for all three of them, a space where corporate pressures and security concerns could be set aside in favor of homework help, art projects, and the kind of ordinary domestic routine that none of them had experienced in years. Stella discovered that she had natural instincts for aunting that had been suppressed by her focus on professional achievement. Ivy found in Stella a female role model who combined intelligence, strength, and genuine interest in her ideas and dreams. For Dominic, watching his sister and daughter develop their own relationship was profoundly healing. The protective instincts that had driven him since childhood were finally able to encompass both of the people who mattered most to him. The family circle that had been broken 23 years earlier was slowly being reconstructed, though in a form none of them could have anticipated. The breakthrough in their investigation came from an unexpected source. Ivy's art teacher at Oakwood Elementary had mentioned that one of the other students had been asking unusual questions about Ivy's family, particularly about where her father worked and what kind of schedule he maintained. The questions had seemed innocent enough to the teacher, but they triggered warning bells for both Dominic and Stella. "Someone is using children to gather intelligence," Stella said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "They're targeting Ivy to get information about our routines and vulnerabilities." The realization escalated their sense of urgency while also providing their first solid lead. The student asking questions was the daughter of James Morrison, Romano Enterprises' former CFO, who had been terminated 6 months earlier for financial irregularities. Morrison had been one of Stella's most trusted advisors before audit irregularities had revealed a pattern of embezzlement and corporate espionage. "Morrison has access to all of your historical security protocols," Dominic said as they reviewed the man's personnel file. "He knows your business relationships, your personal habits, your decision-making patterns. If someone wanted inside information about Romano Enterprises, he would be an ideal consultant. The personal betrayal stung more than Stella had expected. Morrison had been her mentor during her early days at the company, the person who had encouraged her to pursue her own entrepreneurial vision. Learning that he had been systematically stealing from her while positioning himself to benefit from her downfall felt like a violation that went beyond simple corporate crime. "How long do you think he's been planning this?" she asked, her voice carrying the hurt that she usually kept hidden beneath professional composure. "Probably since the day you fired him," Dominic replied. "But the coordination with outside resources suggests this isn't just personal revenge. Morrison is working with people who have the financial backing and operational capability to fund professional criminals and coordinate sophisticated attacks." As they delved deeper into Morrison's connections and financial records, a larger picture began to emerge. The former CFO had been recruited by a consortium of Romano Enterprises competitors, companies that had been systematically losing market share and investment capital to Stella's more innovative and ethically managed operation, rather than compete legitimately. They had chosen to eliminate the competition through criminal means. The discovery filled Stella with a complex mixture of anger, vindication, and sadness. The attacks against her weren't just about business, they were about the fundamental question of whether success achieved through ethical means could survive in a world where unscrupulous actors were willing to use any method to maintain their advantages. "We need to set a trap," Dominic said after they had compiled enough evidence to understand the scope of the conspiracy. "Morrison and his allies are planning something bigger than the previous attempts. If we can force them to reveal themselves, we can end this permanently." Stella nodded, recognizing that they had reached the point where passive defense would no longer be sufficient. "What did you have in mind?" Dominic's expression took on the focused intensity she had learned to associate with his protective mode. "We give them what they think they want, an opportunity to eliminate you that's too good to pass up. But instead of walking into their trap, we turn it into ours." The plan they developed over the following days was risky, complex, and dependent on perfect timing and coordination. But it was also their best chance to identify all the players in the conspiracy and gather enough evidence to ensure that the threats against Romano Enterprises would end permanently. As they prepared for what would essentially be the final confrontation with the forces trying to destroy everything Stella had built, both siblings found themselves reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. They had rediscovered each other in the midst of crisis, rebuilt their relationship while facing external threats, and created a new kind of family that included Ivy and honored the memory of Carmen. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Stella said on the evening before they planned to spring their trap, "I want you to know that finding you again has been the most important thing that's ever happened to me. More important than any business success, any professional achievement, any amount of money or recognition." Dominic reached across the table and took his sister's hand, the gesture carrying 23 years of separation, loss, searching, and finally, reunion. "We're going to end this," he said with quiet certainty. "And then we're going to have the rest of our lives to figure out how to be a family again." The trap was set for Tuesday afternoon at the Morrison Industrial Complex, a sprawling warehouse facility on the outskirts of Millbrook Heights that Romano Enterprises was supposedly considering for acquisition. The location had been chosen specifically for its isolation and the multiple entry and exit points that would give their adversaries confidence while actually providing tactical advantages for the siblings' carefully orchestrated plan. Stella arrived at the facility exactly on schedule, driving her usual luxury sedan and maintaining her normal routine of reviewing documents while her driver handled navigation. To any observer, she appeared to be conducting routine business, evaluating a potential acquisition with the same methodical attention she brought to all corporate decisions. The only difference was the nearly invisible earpiece that kept her in constant communication with Dominic, who had positioned himself strategically throughout the facility. The preliminary meeting with the facility's management team proceeded exactly as planned, giving Stella the opportunity to survey the interior layout while establishing her presence for any watchers. The warehouse was a maze of corridors, storage areas, and office spaces that provided numerous opportunities for concealment and ambush, exactly the kind of environment that would appeal to people planning an attack. Phase 1 complete, Stella said softly into her concealed microphone as she concluded the tour and moved toward the executive conference room, where the serious negotiations would supposedly take place. Moving to position 2. Dominic's voice came through her earpiece with calm professionalism. I have visual contact with our primary target. Morrison arrived 10 minutes ago with 2 associates and is positioned in the south parking area. Additional vehicles are stationed at the north and east entrances. Looks like they're planning to box you in. The confirmation that James Morrison was personally overseeing the operation added another layer of betrayal to the situation. This wasn't just business warfare conducted through hired criminals. It was personal revenge being carried out by someone who had shared Stella's confidence and trusted access to her most sensitive corporate information. As Stella settled into the conference room and began the elaborate charade of reviewing acquisition documents, she found herself remembering the early days of Romano Enterprises when Morrison had been her most valued advisor. He had helped her navigate complex financial arrangements, introduced her to key investors, and provided the kind of mentorship that had been crucial during her transition from employee to entrepreneur. Visual contact with secondary targets, Dominic reported. 3 men in tactical gear approaching from the west entrance. These are the same ones from the previous attempts. This isn't random muscle. It's the same coordinated team. The realization that they were facing the same criminals who had attacked her twice before added urgency to their operation. These men had demonstrated professional competence and a willingness to escalate violence if their initial plans failed. The stakes were higher than simple corporate espionage. This was a situation that could easily turn deadly if any element of their plan went wrong. Moving to final position, Stella said, gathering her documents and preparing to leave the conference room. According to their script, she would now exit through the main entrance, providing her attackers with what appeared to be the perfect opportunity to complete their mission. But instead of heading toward the obvious exit, Stella moved through a series of predetermined routes that would lead her adversaries into the trap that Dominic had spent the morning constructing. Years of corporate strategy had taught her the value of misdirection and controlled information, skills that translated surprisingly well to tactical situations. The attack came exactly as they had anticipated. As Stella walked through the main corridor toward what appeared to be the building's primary exit, Morrison's team moved into position with the coordinated precision that had characterized their previous attempts. But this time, their target was prepared. Now, Dominic said into his microphone, and several things happened simultaneously. The lights in the main corridor cut out, plunging the area into darkness that gave Dominic significant tactical advantages. While disorienting the attackers, emergency lighting kicked in 30 seconds later, just long enough for him to position himself between the assault team and his sister while maintaining the element of surprise. Confrontation that followed was unlike their previous encounters in the parking garage. This time, Dominic was working in an environment he had prepared specifically for this purpose, with improvised weapons and defensive positions that maximized his evasive abilities while minimizing the attacker's advantages. The first assailant found himself entangled in a carefully positioned network of industrial cables that had been rigged to respond to pressure triggers. The second discovered that the floor panels he was crossing had been loosened to create unstable footing that sent him sprawling into a strategically placed barrier of warehouse equipment. But it was the third attacker who provided the real breakthrough in their investigation. Instead of engaging physically, This man immediately reached for his communication device, clearly intending to report the failure of their mission to whoever was coordinating the overall operation. Dominic's intervention was swift and precise, disabling the man while preserving both his communication equipment and his ability to provide information about the larger conspiracy. Within minutes, he had secured all three attackers and was in position to trace their communications back to the source. "Dominic, we have a problem." Stella's voice came through his earpiece with unusual tension. "Morrison isn't here for the attack, he's here for a meeting. There's someone else in the building, someone who's been running this entire operation." The revelation that Morrison was not the primary antagonist, but rather another piece in a larger puzzle, changed everything about their situation. If the former CFO was taking orders from someone else, then the threat to Romano Enterprises was more complex and potentially more dangerous than they had realized. Moving quickly through the warehouse facility, Dominic made his way toward the executive conference area where Stella had reported seeing Morrison in conversation with an unidentified individual. The building's layout worked in his favor, providing multiple routes and concealment opportunities that allowed him to approach undetected. What he found in the executive conference room stopped him cold. Morrison was indeed present, but he was clearly the subordinate in the conversation taking place. Across the table from him sat Arthur Young, the chairman of Romano Enterprises' board of directors and the man who had been Stella's most consistent supporter during her rise to CEO. Betrayal was more devastating than anything they could have anticipated. Young had been present for every major decision Romano Enterprises had made, every strategic initiative, every security protocol implementation. He had been the person Stella turned to for advice, the voice of experience and wisdom that had guided her through the most challenging aspects of building her business empire. The attacks were supposed to frighten her into accepting more conservative business strategies, Young was saying, his voice carrying none of the grandfatherly warmth that had characterized his interactions with Stella. But she's proven more resilient than anticipated. Direct elimination has become the only viable option. Morrison nodded nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the escalation from intimidation to murder. "Arthur, when we started this arrangement, you assured me that we could achieve our objectives without permanent harm to Stella. She's brilliant, innovative. The industry needs people like her, just not in positions where they can disrupt established profit structures." Young's laugh was cold and calculating. "The industry needs people like her working for people like us, not competing with us. Romano Enterprises has cost our consortium billions of dollars and lost market share over the past 3 years. Stella's ethical business practices and innovative approaches have made our traditional methods look outdated and exploitative." The conversation revealed the full scope of the conspiracy, not just an attempt to eliminate a business competitor, but a systematic effort to prevent ethical innovation from challenging established corporate power structures. Young represented a network of traditional companies that saw Stella's success as an existential threat to their ability to maintain profits through exploitation and market manipulation. "She's disrupted too many established arrangements," Young continued. "Government contracts that have been locked up for decades, supplier relationships that have provided reliable profit margins, investor partnerships that have been carefully cultivated over generations. Her approach to business threatens an entire ecosystem of mutually beneficial relationships." Dominic realized that he was witnessing the exposure of corporate corruption that went far beyond simple competition or personal revenge. This was about preserving a system that benefited a small group of powerful actors at the expense of innovation, ethics, and fair competition. As he listened to Young outline the next phase of their plan, which involved eliminating both Stella and any evidence of Romano Enterprises' acquisition strategies, Dominic felt the protective fury that had defined his relationship with his sister since childhood. But now it was informed by adult understanding of the stakes involved and the resources necessary to fight this kind of systemic corruption. Moving carefully, he activated the recording equipment they had prepared for this operation while positioning himself to intervene if the conversation moved beyond planning to immediate action. The evidence they were gathering would be crucial for prosecuting the conspiracy, but only if both he and Stella survived to present it. The attack team has failed to report, Morrison said, checking his phone with obvious anxiety. Either they've been delayed or something has gone wrong with the operation. Young's expression hardened. Then we proceed to the backup plan. If Stella can't be eliminated discreetly, we'll have to accept more public methods. A tragic accident. During a facility inspection, perhaps. The important thing is that she doesn't leave this building alive. The shift from hired criminals to personal involvement changed the tactical situation dramatically. Young and Morrison were not trained fighters, but they were desperate men with everything to lose if their conspiracy was exposed. That combination could make them more dangerous than professional attackers because their actions would be unpredictable and motivated by panic rather than strategy. Dominic made his decision quickly, moving into the conference room with the controlled aggression that had served him well during emergency responses. The psychological impact of his sudden appearance was as important as any physical intervention. Both men were clearly shocked to discover that their supposedly perfect trap had been compromised. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the calm authority that had once reassured accident victims while securing potential threats. "I think we need to have a conversation about your business practices." The confrontation that followed was less about physical violence than psychological pressure. Young and Morrison were corporate manipulators, not street fighters, and their confidence evaporated rapidly when faced with someone who understood both their methods and their vulnerabilities. Within minutes, Dominic had secured both men while preserving the evidence they had gathered about the broader conspiracy. The recording devices had captured enough information to expose not just the immediate threats against Estella, but the network of corporate corruption that had funded and coordinated the attacks. As police sirens approached the warehouse facility, summoned by the silent alarm system that Dominic had activated, both siblings found themselves confronting the reality that they had uncovered something much larger than personal revenge or simple business competition. They had exposed a systematic effort to prevent ethical innovation from challenging established corporate power, a conspiracy that reached into some of the most respected businesses and institutions in their industry. The betrayal by Arthur Young was particularly devastating for Stella, who had trusted him with not just business decisions, but personal confidences about her goals, fears, and vision for Romano Enterprises. Learning that her mentor and trusted advisor had been systematically undermining her while planning her elimination was a violation that went to the core of everything she had believed about business relationships and professional integrity. But as they stood together in the warehouse facility, surrounded by the evidence of the conspiracy they had exposed and the criminals they had captured, both siblings realized that they had accomplished something more significant than simply protecting one company or one person. They had demonstrated that ethical business practices could not only survive, but prevail against systematic corruption, and that family bonds could provide the strength necessary to fight battles that seemed impossible to win alone. The celebration of victory was short-lived. As police units surrounded the Morrison Industrial Complex and federal investigators began processing the evidence of corporate conspiracy, Dominic's phone rang with a call that turned their triumph into their worst nightmare. "Daddy?" Ivy's voice came through the speaker, small and frightened in a way that immediately triggered every protective instinct Dominic possessed. "There are some men here who say they need to talk to you. They say you took something that belongs to them." The line went dead before Dominic could respond, but the message was devastatingly clear. While they had been focused on capturing Morrison and Young, Someone else had moved against the one target that would guarantee their cooperation, his daughter. "They have Ivy," Dominic said, his voice carrying a controlled fury that made Stella step back involuntarily. In that moment, she saw not the gentle custodian or even the protective brother, but the emergency responder who had once faced life-and-death situations where hesitation meant failure. The phone rang again immediately, this time showing an unknown number. Dominic answered on the first ring, his hand gripping the device with enough force to crack the plastic casing. "Mr. Bianchi," a calm professional voice said. "My name is Hugo Evans, and I represent certain business interests that have been damaged by your recent activities. I have your daughter, and she's perfectly safe for the moment. Whether she remains that way depends entirely on your willingness to cooperate." The name meant nothing to Dominic, but Stella's sharp intake of breath indicated recognition. "Hugo Evans was Romano Enterprises' head of security until I fired him last year for selling company information," she whispered. "He knows all of our protocols, all of our safe houses, everything." The revelation added another layer of betrayal to their situation. Evans had been responsible for protecting Stella and her business operations, but he had been working against her interests while maintaining his position of trust. His dismissal had apparently driven him to seek revenge through increasingly dangerous means. "What do you want?" Dominic asked, forcing his voice to remain level despite the terror clawing at his chest. "Simple," Evans replied. "You're going to release Mr. Young and Mr. Morrison, destroy all recordings and evidence you've gathered, and ensure that Romano Enterprises withdraws all pending legal actions. In return, your daughter will be returned to you unharmed." The demand was both predictable and impossible. Releasing Young and Morrison would mean allowing the conspiracy to continue, putting not just Stella but countless other ethical business leaders at risk. But refusing would mean sacrificing Ivy, which was unthinkable for Dominic. "You have 30 minutes to make your decision," Evans continued. "I'll be in touch with instructions for the exchange. And Mr. Bianchi, any attempt to involve additional law enforcement will result in your daughter disappearing permanently." As the call ended, Dominic found himself facing the kind of impossible choice that had defined the worst moments of his professional life as an EMT. Save one person or save many. Protect the individual or protect the system. Choose between family and principle when both were essential to who he was. "We're going to get her back," Stella said, her voice carrying absolute certainty despite the complexity of their situation. "And we're going to make sure these people never threaten another family." But even as she spoke, both siblings understood the magnitude of the challenge they faced. Evans had Ivy, presumably with backup support and escape routes already planned. He knew their methods, their resources, and their personal vulnerabilities. Most importantly, he understood that threatening Dominic's daughter was the one strategy that could force them to abandon everything they had worked to accomplish. "He'll have taken her to a secondary location," Dominic said, his training automatically engaging as he analyzed the tactical situation. "Somewhere isolated with multiple exit strategies and communication capabilities. Evans knows I'll come for her, so he'll be prepared for that." Stella was already accessing her phone, pulling up building schematics and security databases that Romano Enterprises maintained for various properties throughout Millbrook Heights. Evans had access to all of our safe house locations, but he also knew our competitor analysis. If he's working with Young's consortium, he might be using one of their facilities. The search that followed was methodical and desperate, combining Stella's corporate intelligence resources with Dominic's tactical assessment skills. They had less than 30 minutes to locate Ivy and develop a rescue plan that could succeed. Against a former security professional who knew their capabilities and limitations. "Here," Stella said, pointing to a property listing on her screen. "Grandview Industrial Park. It's owned by one of Young's shell companies. Isolated location, multiple access roads. if Evans wanted a place to conduct an exchange while maintaining tactical advantages, this would be ideal. Dominic studied the facility layout, automatically identifying potential entry points, defensive positions, and escape routes. But his analysis was complicated by the emotional reality that his daughter was being held by people who had already demonstrated their willingness to use violence to achieve their objectives. "I can't ask you to risk this," he said to Stella, recognizing that the rescue attempt would be dangerous for both of them. "This is my responsibility, my family." "She's my family too," Stella interrupted, her voice carrying the fierce protectiveness that had been awakened by their reunion. "I've spent 23 years wondering what happened to the brother who promised to always protect me. Now I have the chance to help him protect the person who matters most to him." The statement crystallized something fundamental about their relationship and their shared values. They had both built their adult lives around different forms of service and protection. Stella through ethical business leadership, Dominic through emergency response and devoted parenting. The threat to Ivy wasn't just an attack on his family. It was an attack on everything they represented. The rescue plan they developed was necessarily improvised and extremely risky. Evans would be expecting a direct assault or a negotiated exchange, but he might not anticipate a coordinated operation that combined Stella's corporate resources with Dominic's tactical skills. "The FBI team is 20 minutes out," Stella reported after completing a series of encrypted calls. "But we can't wait for them if Evans moves to a tertiary location. We need to act now." As they drove toward Grandview Industrial Park and Stella's armored sedan, both siblings found themselves confronting the possibility that their reunion might be brief and their victory over the conspiracy might come at an unacceptable personal cost. But they also understood that some battles were worth any sacrifice, and protecting family was one of them. The industrial park was exactly as isolated as the property listings had indicated, a collection of warehouses and office buildings surrounded by empty lots and accessed by a single main road. Evans had chosen his location well, providing himself with clear sight lines and multiple escape routes, while forcing any rescue attempt to approach across open ground. 2 vehicles in the main parking area, Dominic observed as they conducted their reconnaissance. At least 4 personnel visible, probably more inside the main building. Professional positioning, coordinated communication. Evans has brought serious resources to this confrontation. The realization that they were facing a well-equipped and strategically positioned force added urgency to their mission while highlighting the personal stakes involved. This wasn't just about corporate conspiracy anymore. It was about a little girl who had become the target of adult conflicts she couldn't possibly understand. As they prepared for what would essentially be the final battle in their war against the forces trying to destroy everything they had built, both Dominic and Stella found themselves drawing on reserves of courage and determination that they hadn't known they possessed. The successful CEO and the humble custodian were really a sister and brother who had learned that the most important victories were the ones that protected the people you loved. The exchange was scheduled to take place in 15 minutes, but neither sibling intended to honor Evans' terms. Instead, they were going to use those 15 minutes to demonstrate that family bonds could overcome any conspiracy, any betrayal, any threat that corruption could devise. The rescue operation unfolded with the precision that came from combining Stella's strategic intelligence with Dominic's tactical expertise. While Evans waited in the main warehouse expecting a desperate father to surrender everything for his daughter's safety, the siblings approached from an unexpected direction using service tunnels that Stella's corporate database had revealed. "I can see Ivy through the west window," Dominic whispered into his communication device. "She's secured but unharmed, approximately 20 feet from Evans' position. 2 guards visible, likely more in concealed positions." The sight of his daughter, sitting calmly in a chair with her school backpack beside her, sent a surge of protective fury through Dominic that had to be carefully controlled. Ivy looked frightened but alert, her natural resilience evident even in this terrifying situation. "Federal backup is 3 minutes out," Stella reported. "We can wait for support or she's been scared long enough," Dominic said, making the decision that defined everything about who he was as a father and as a man. "I'm going in now." What happened next lasted less than 90 seconds, but would be remembered by all 3 family members for the rest of their lives. Dominic's entry through the service door caught Evan's team completely off guard, his movements so swift and purposeful that their carefully planned defensive positions became liabilities rather than advantages. The first guard went down to a calculated strike that left him unconscious but uninjured. The second found himself disarmed and restrained before he could raise an alarm. Evans himself, caught between his communication station and his hostage, made the fatal mistake of reaching for Ivy as a human shield. That was when Hugo Evans discovered that threatening Dominic, Bianchi's daughter, was the one line that should never be crossed. "Daddy." Ivy's voice cut through the controlled chaos as Dominic secured the last threat and swept her into his arms. The reunion was fierce and desperate. 20 minutes of absolute terror dissolved in the safety of unconditional love. But it was Stella's arrival that completed the picture of their new family reality. She entered the warehouse as FBI agents secured the perimeter, but her focus was entirely on her brother and niece, the 2 people who had become her anchor in a world that had suddenly made sense again. "Is everyone okay?" she asked, though her eyes were already confirming what mattered most. Ivy was safe, Dominic was unhurt, and the conspiracy that had threatened everything they valued was finally over. 6 months later, the transformation was evident in every aspect of their lives. Romano Enterprises had not only survived the corporate conspiracy, but emerged stronger, with new security protocols, ethical business practices that set industry standards, and a family leadership structure that combined Stella's visionary capabilities with Dominic's operational expertise. The Sunday dinners had evolved into something sacred for all 3 of them, a weekly celebration of the family they had chosen to build together, despite the forces that had tried to tear them apart. Their modest apartment had been replaced by a house with enough space for Ivy's art projects, Stella's home office, and Dominic's workshop where he restored antique furniture as a hobby. "Aunt Stella, do you think we should add Uncle Dom to my family tree project?" Ivy asked one evening as they worked on homework together at the kitchen table that had become the center of their domestic universe. Stella smiled, watching her brother's expression as he processed their niece's casual use of titles that meant everything to siblings who had spent decades believing they were alone in the world. "I think your family tree is exactly right the way it is," she replied. "Sometimes the most important families are the ones you choose to build together." The criminal conspiracy that had threatened Romano Enterprises resulted in federal convictions for Arthur Young, James Morrison, and Hugo Evans, along with a network of accomplices whose corporate corruption had infected multiple industries. But for Dominic and Stella, the real victory wasn't legal justice, it was the quiet evening routines, the shared responsibilities, and the absolute certainty that they would never be alone again. As Dominic tucked Ivy into bed that night, reading from the chapter book they had been working through together, Stella stood in the doorway watching the family ritual that had become part of her own life. She had built a business empire worth billions of dollars, but this simple moment, her brother's gentle voice, her niece's sleepy questions, the security of ordinary domestic love, was the most valuable thing she had ever acquired. "Good night, sweet pea," Dominic whispered, kissing Ivy's forehead just as he had every night for years, but now with the knowledge that their family circle was complete. "Good night, Daddy. Good night, Aunt Stella," Ivy replied, her voice already drowsy with the absolute trust that came from being surrounded by people who would protect her from anything the world could devise. And in the soft light of the hallway, as they turned off the bedroom lamp and closed the door on another ordinary evening, Both siblings understood that they had accomplished something more precious than any business success or professional achievement. They had proved that love could survive any separation, overcome any betrayal, and build something stronger than the forces that had tried to destroy them. The custodian and the CEO were really just a brother and sister who had found their way. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.